entire history of gaming, there are only a few titles that hold a place in the public consciousness like Duke Nukem Forever. Originally supposed to be a quick follow-up to the 1996 bestseller Duke Nukem 3D, Forever would live up to its name and enter an endless development cycle that brought its whole crew down with it. Well before finally burning out on May 6, 2009, it had become a running industry joke, a comedy of errors at every possible level of game creation. It is the epitaph of Apogee, a once vibrant company that came from a basement programmer who single-handedly combined new technologies and a savvy business model into one of the most cutting-edge and profitable publishing outfits of his day. That a house that innovation built could allow itself to stagnate so dramatically and so chronically is truly one of the great tragedies of the industry. A tragedy not because they were always doomed to failure, but because they once had the resources and the opportunity to become the most successful game maker in the market. How on earth could they have let it happen? To understand the fall, you first need to understand the rise. And to understand how it reached its apogee, you need to meet a boy who once spent his days putting quarters in a slot. In the early 80s, Scott Miller was an avid gamer who won some arcade tournaments in the local Dallas scene. With a little bit of programming experience under his belt, he also made a number of games on his own time. These he distributed through bulletin board systems, or BBSs, precursors to the modern World Wide Web. He would announce on the board that he had a new game and that anybody who wanted it could download it. While common practice in today's networked world, this was bleeding-edge technology at the time. His familiarity with the subject led to a career as a freelance gaming journalist, writing for various publications, including a weekly column in the Dallas Morning News. But as he started writing more and more reviews, he found that he was beginning to realize what made a game work and what didn't. And so, in 1986, he decided to apply everything he'd learned and start developing games seriously, with an eye to making it a second job. The first result of this effort was Beyond the Titanic, an all-text adventure game. This was quickly followed by Supernova in the same genre. The business model was simple. He would release it as shareware on bulletin board systems just like his older games, but in the game itself he would ask for donations if the player liked it. It seems pretty straightforward, but at the time, this was groundbreaking. Before BBSs, distributing a game required the capital and ability to produce large numbers of discs, put every one of them in its own packaging, and then ship these to either mass-market retailers or the consumer directly. But Miller was one of a small number of programmers that had harnessed the power of the emerging internet phenomenon to cut all of this out. They didn't have to deal with manufacturing costs, shipping manifests, or insurance policies. All he needed was a computer and a modem, and he could deliver his product to anyone, anywhere. This is 1986. Windows and the Macintosh had barely hit the marketplace, and these guys were inventing digital distribution. And Miller was the very first to give digital distribution a commercial spin. But despite the incredible leap in business practice, the economics weren't working out. Miller would be among the first to ever realize that people on the internet, even the early internet, didn't like paying for things they could get for free. Despite his in-game pleas for donation, very few gamers ever did so. If Miller wanted to make this work as a second job, he'd need to increase his revenue somehow. How could he get gamers to pay? The solution he came up with was forehead-slappingly obvious. Instead of releasing the entire game for free, he would only release his first chapter, or episode, for free. And so, in 1987, he posted Kingdom of Kraus up on BBSs around the world, which was only episode 1 of the Kraus series. At the end of the playthrough, the gamer would get a promise for 2 more episodes, and an address. To get those episodes, they'd have to send in a check. No more donations. Miller was making a sale. He figured that this would increase revenue. It didn't. Revenue exploded. Miller went from having a hobby to a second income source overnight. The strategy had worked, and shareware finally had a business model that was profitable. This model came to be known as the Apogee model, after the new name for Miller's enterprise, Apogee Software. Each new game that Miller produced followed the same formula: a free first episode to entice gamers to buy the following episodes. It would be years before other companies caught on to the simple genius of the Apogee model, which has since led to the modern practice of releasing a demo before the full game. And Miller realized that it didn't only have to work with his games. He was in a perfect position to become a one-man publishing house using his Apogee model on other developers' games. And so he reached out to as many other talented developers as he could find, promising them a standard profit-sharing deal. Apogee would post the game to all the bulletin boards, host the game files on its servers, and use its good reputation in the community to boost interest in the title. What was more, Miller promised that the developer would retain full IP rights to their game, a deal that few other publishers would hand away. It all combined for a meteoric rise. By 1990, Miller was making more money from his one-man publisher-developer than he was from his freelance journalism. Recognizing that he could have a serious business on his hands, Miller quit his day job to focus on Apogee full-time. To make Apogee into a AAA studio, Scott Miller was going to need more employees than Scott Miller. And so he turned to his old high school buddy and fellow game lover, George Broussard, and brought him on as employee number 2. Little did they know that their combined talents would launch them to the very top echelon of the gaming world, before their overconfidence crashed the whole thing down on their heads. After winning a few arcade tournaments and programming a few games, Scott Miller became a freelance gaming journalist. But after a number of reviews, Miller thought he'd figured out what made a game work. So he set out to form his own company, Apogee, in which he would publish the games he made on bulletin board systems. As a precursor to the modern internet, bulletin boards allowed him to host game files on his own computer and let others download them as they willed. Digital distribution in its earliest form. But as with other programmers making shareware, he found that asking for donations didn't lead to much income. His big break came with a simple change in business model. Instead of releasing the whole game for free, he would only release a portion for free and then charge the player if they wanted to play the rest. This Apogee model was years ahead of its time and was the start of the modern practice of releasing demos. When the first game to use this model, Kingdom of Kroz, became a smash hit, he knew he was ready to take the next step into serious game development. And to help him make the jump, he brought on board his second employee, his old high school buddy, George Broussard, in 1990. The next few years would see the company skyrocket, as Broussard created a character that would become an icon, and as they published the very first title in gaming's biggest genre. Miller had been reaching out to various developers in order to publish their games. To do that, he had to play a lot of games, and in 1990 he played one called Dangerous Dave. He liked it a lot, but noticed that the makers worked for Softdisk, a studio so paranoid that they actually read their programmers' fan mail to make sure no rival studio wanted to hire them. To get around Softdisk's censorship, he sent the game designer 4 different fan letters, each signed with a different name. But all 4 of them asked the designer to respond to him, all at the exact same phone number and address. Softdisk didn't catch on and let the man see his letters. In fact, even he didn't realize the duplication until he saw the same address in a gaming magazine about Miller. Finally putting 2 and 2 together, he picked up his pen and wrote back a response. His name was John Romero. Romero and his associates, John Carmack, Tom Hall, and Adrian Carmack, liked what Miller was proposing, and so they set out to make a game that Apogee would publish online. The result was Commander Keen in December 1990, which was an instant success. Apogee was happy, they had a hit on their hands. Romero, Hall, and the 2 unrelated Carmacks were even more happy and left Softdisk to found their own company, id Software. As id continued to pump out Commander Keen titles for their new publisher, Apogee was on a roll. 1991 was a big year for the company. Miller and Broussard were more than just marketers. They kept heavily involved in the game development process of their outside partners. As their business was booming, they had plenty of games to produce. One of these was Monuments of Mars, which helped change gaming forever by taking something out: lives. No more game over screens. The player could keep playing as long as he wanted without worrying about how many lives remained. This philosophy has eventually made its way into all modern games. That same year would see the release of several other games, including a little side-scroller with a blonde dude named Duke. Duke Nukem followed the same formula as most 2D shooters, but did it with a sense of personality and macho vibe that other games couldn't touch. The story, such as it was suitably ridiculous. The nefarious Dr. Proton had been madly making malevolent mechs to meddle in man's domain, and only a dude with more testosterone than brains could possibly stop him. It was a big hit for Apogee at the time, selling between 60 and 70,000 copies. But Apogee's next big title would make that macho look weenie. In 1992, Apogee released id Software's latest game, which was just another shooter. Except, there was just something a little odd about it. No, it wasn't the crazy Nazi sorcerers. No, it wasn't the great weapon selection. And it wasn't the beautifully designed maps and top-notch graphics either. No, what they had made was an absolute revelation. A first-person shooter. Technically, shooters from the first-person perspective had been made before, dating all the way back to Maze War and Spacem in 1974. But all these had been on obscure platforms that never reached broad distribution. By 1992, DOS and Windows were dominant, and id's game was the first FPS to hit a globally accepted operating system. Wolfenstein 3D was a firestorm. Released with the Apogee model, it would go on to be the company's biggest seller to date. Duke Nukem, a successful title, had earned them about $15,000 a month. Wolfenstein made them $200,000 a month for a year and a half. There was nothing else like it, and Apogee had it exclusively. If there was any lingering doubt that digital distribution was a serious publishing option, Wolfenstein blew it away like a Nazi prison guard. But inadvertently, Wolfenstein's biggest casualty was 2D gaming. In 1993, Apogee released Duke Nukem 2 to find that it hardly did better than the first Duke. All around the world, developers and publishers were switching to the third dimension. Wolfenstein had showed them the way to gaming's future. But to Apogee's horror, id would not be going there with them. For all its bleeding-edge distribution methods, Apogee was still taking orders by phone or paper mail. The id team realized that simply digitizing the whole process would save the consumer time and effort and lead to increased sales. But even when id brought this up to their publisher, Apogee didn't evolve with the times. Seeing no other option, id abandoned Apogee and decided to self-publish their next game, a title that would forever change the gaming industry and give Apogee the motivation they needed to reach the top. After video game developer and publisher Apogee was founded by one guy as a second job, it quickly ballooned into a major business. Scott Miller's idea to distribute a small portion of a game online and then charge for the rest was decades ahead of its time. As the company was booming, it started creating its own new franchises, like Duke Nukem, while at the same time helping other young developers get started, like id Software. The partnership of id's games and Apogee's publishing muscle proved to be an unbeatable combination, culminating in the release of the first modern first-person shooter, Wolfenstein 3D, in 1992. Wolfenstein changed the direction of gaming forever and made Apogee more money than they'd ever seen before. It seemed like the stars were all aligned for the publisher. But for all their high-tech distribution models, Apogee still processed sales by hand, from phone or paper mail orders. id, fed up with this system, abandoned the guys who had gotten them off the ground and self-published their next title. The gaming world and Apogee would never be the same again. In 1993, id decided to self-publish their next game, using the exact same digital distribution model that Apogee used. For many reasons, from its beautiful graphics to its multi-height environments to its networked multiplayer, Doom became one of the highest-grossing, most influential, and legendary games ever made. And Apogee didn't see a dime. Their relationship with id, already bruised, became even worse. After Wolfenstein 3D, id asked Apogee to make them a sequel. However, id canceled this project shortly before Doom released, probably to give Doom less competition. For Apogee, this meant that they had spent a year of time, money, and talent on a game that wouldn't even see the light of day. More importantly, it was supposed to be Apogee's first 3D title. After Wolfenstein and Doom, it was clear that this was all gamers wanted now. Without their Wolfenstein sequel to legitimize them as a 3D developer, Apogee had only their 2D titles to their name. In the end, they decided to try and salvage what they had. So they spent another 2 years making tweaks and changes to the Wolfenstein sequel, enough so that it wouldn't be recognizable as Wolfenstein anymore, and thus they wouldn't be sued when they released it. It was finally published in 1995 as Rise of the Triad, a brand new IP. Despite the earlier setbacks, the game sold well and proved that Apogee could be competitive in 3D. Right after the game's release, Apogee took a long, hard look at the gaming market. They concluded that the audience was splintering into numerous different genres. So Apogee decided that instead of publishing every game under the name Apogee, they would use a different brand name for each genre. Since 3D was clearly the emerging superstar, the first brand name that Apogee made was 3D Realms. To be clear, legally Apogee was still Apogee, but when they published a 3D game, they would publish it under the name 3D Realms. And so, the company got to work on 2 games that would go under the newly minted 3D Realms banner. The first was begun by the Rise of the Triads team. It was an innovative science fiction game called Prey. We'll talk about that later. The other team was led by George Broussard, the guy behind the 2 Duke Nukems. And what was he planning for his first 3D game? What else but Duke Nukem 3D? Duke Nukem 3D was made using a game engine called Build, which had been single-handedly built by Ken Silverman, a high school teenager. Much unlike Prey, Duke Nukem 3D's production cycle went quite smoothly, and in 1996, the blonde guy with a buzz cut kicked down the doors of gamers everywhere. Though, perhaps it's more technically accurate to say that Duke blew down the door, the house, the block, and a good portion of the town. Where earlier games in the series had been modest successes, Duke Nukem 3D was the single biggest hit in Apogee's history. It sold 3.5 million copies. For reference, their previous mega hit Wolfenstein 3D sold all of 200,000 copies, or a little over 1/20th of what Duke sold. The title was an excellent product in the young FPS genre, which was still rife with cheap Doom knockoffs. As a matter of fact, up until 1996, most FPSs were simply referred to as Doom clones. Duke 3D was one of the first to break that trend. It had more variety, more locations, more interactivity, and more macho. Lots and lots more macho. The strong sense of personality imbued in the Duke game helped it stand out from the generic crowd. No other game was as flippant, as outrageous, as unabashedly male fantasy as Duke Nukem. Taking campiness to a whole new level, Mr. Nukem was a foul-mouthed, trash-talking super stud who loved his ladies almost as much as he loved his bullets. His endless one-liners and ripped physique were a clear throwback to 80s action flicks.
Damn, I'm looking good.
And he could do almost anything he wanted in this world, from flushing toilets, to playing pool, to checking himself out in a mirror. In an age when the only famous game characters were the kid-friendly Pac-Man and Mario, Duke was an instant icon. Of course, the game came with its fair share of controversy. While it looks tame today, back in '96, Duke Nukem 3D was a pretty gory title. But violence is never as controversial as sex, and Duke Nukem 3D had nudity, a rarity in gaming then as it is today. Parents weren't pleased to learn that the game was teaching their sons how to tip strippers.
You wanna dance? Shake it, baby.
Despite, or more likely directly because of this controversy, Duke sold and sold and sold. He was there to kick ass and chew bubblegum, and he was all out of gum. Apogee and its 3D Realms label were on top of the world. They had gone from a couple of enthusiasts to one of the biggest studios in the world. This was their moment to shine, but their future wasn't what they'd hoped. Unknown to them at the time, 1997 would in fact be the last year that they ever released a game of their own. In that year, they published Balls of Steel, a pinball game released under the new Pinball Wizards brand, and Shadow Warrior, released under 3D Realms. And then, they went dark. You see, they were still working on that Prey game, and Duke Nukem, well, they were working on a new game for him too. Years of silence went by after this. Apogee licensed Duke out to some other developers, who made Duke Nukem games for consoles in the following years. A big morale boost for the company came in 1999. Legendary metal band Megadeth did a cover of the Duke Nukem theme song, Grab Bag, which had originally been inspired by Megadeth.
Come get some.
And in 2001, they published a game by a little Finnish developer called Remedy, Max Payne. Max Payne would go on to be an unexpected super smash, outselling even Duke Nukem 3D. However, shortly after its release, Remedy sold the Max Payne IP rights to Rockstar, after which Apogee could no longer publish the game. After this, all they had to their name was Prey and Duke. What could possibly go wrong?
It's time to abort your whole friggin' species.
What happened? After 10 years of burning up the sales charts with a slew of groundbreaking games, developer and publisher Apogee, also known as 3D Realms, was on top of the world. In 1995, they released Rise of the Triad. Afterwards, that crew got to work on a game called Prey. In 1996, they released Duke Nukem 3D. Afterwards, that crew got to work on a game called Duke Nukem Forever. By the standards of the mid-90s, both games should have been completed in a year or two for a few $100,000. Prey took 10 years and millions of dollars to finally release, and the unreleased Duke Nukem Forever ended production 13 years later after having spent the entire Apogee fortune. What happened? Lean back and enjoy yourselves for this one, guys. It's gonna be a treat. It's easy to forget now, but you have to remember, when these projects started, they were great ideas. Rise of the Triad was a successful game, and its crew had a lot of cool new concepts for their new title, Prey. Right at the beginning, they were offered the chance to use the build engine that powered Duke Nukem 3D. However, they opted to develop a more powerful next-gen engine for themselves instead. Alright, so far, so good. They knew they wanted another shooter game, but at the same time, they wanted to turn the genre on its ear. So they went for a couple of innovative choices, making the hero a Native American instead of a white guy, and coming up with the concept of portals for the first time in gaming history. Portals were shortcuts through space that allowed the player to move vast distances instantly. It was a game-changing feature. It was also a technical nightmare. Getting the engine code to a point that it could handle portals took more time and effort than expected. Worse, project lead Tom Hall did not get along creatively with Apogee heads Scott Miller and George Broussard. In 1996, Hall decided he'd had enough and walked away from the project. Unfortunately, most of the Prey crew followed him. In game development terms, that's bad. But also in '96, Duke Nukem 3D came out and sold 3.5 million copies, so all seemed to be going well for the company. It was announced in '97 that a sequel was on the way, once again under the leadership of George Broussard. A 1998 release date was also set. Miller and Broussard had huge ambitions for Duke, hoping to expand Duke into other media for decades to come. But for now, they just had the one game in the works, and for it, they went back to their old contacts at id Software. Despite their troubled earlier relationship, Apogee licensed the new Quake 2 engine from id and got to work. Meanwhile, a brand new crew was hired to pick up Prey where it had been left off. Enough new work was done to show off a demo of the game at E3 1997, which was well received by the press. So 1998 should have been a huge year for the company, with the release of both Prey and Duke Nukem Forever. Both games came to E3 and showed off their muscle for all to see. Then, both teams came back to Dallas. Independently, both the Prey team and the Duke crew decided that their engines weren't cutting it. On the Prey side, their home-built proprietary engine wasn't looking as good as they'd hoped. On the Duke side, the Quake 2 engine was proving to be better suited to small, enclosed environments than big, wide-open spaces. And for Duke, they wanted big, epic set pieces. So virtually at the same time, the Prey team decided to stop design and retool the whole engine, and the Duke team announced that they were switching to the new Unreal Engine from Epic Mega Games. The latter was a huge deal. They'd already spent a small fortune licensing the Quake 2 engine. Now they'd have to do that again with Unreal and rebuild every single asset they'd made since the start of the project. This was not a good turn of events. As if that wasn't enough bad news, by the end of the year, the Prey crew was floundering. The artists and designers couldn't work without an engine, and the engine guys were months away from finishing their overhaul. Tensions mounted, and once again, the project leads left the company. Sensing disaster and with enough issues on the Duke side of things, Apogee quietly shut down the game. Years of production time, budget, and energy, gone. So all eyes were on Duke Nukem Forever to save the day. As a company, they were still in good shape. Duke Nukem 3D had been such a massive hit that they had money to burn. Unfortunately, Broussard decided to burn it, and burn it, and burn it. Worse, because of 3D's success, Broussard got it into his head that Forever needed to be the best game anybody had ever seen. The problem was, there are lots of talented people in the gaming industry, and they were making great games. Anytime Broussard played a game with a feature or graphics or a mechanic or a setting that Duke Nukem didn't have, he decided that his crew needed to make it. The horrible irony here was that Broussard was desperately trying to lead the pack by following the crowd. The problem with this philosophy is that it doesn't lead to a focused project. Broussard had a laundry list of elements he wanted in his game, but no plan for how they should tie together. Eventually, Forever became a jumbled mess of good ideas that in no way cohered into an actual game. Still, to the outside world, it looked like they were crafting a masterpiece. In 2000, Take-Two Interactive acquired the publishing rights to Duke Nukem Forever for $12 million. Surely with that much new cash, Apogee could wait as long as they wanted to release the game, right? But at E3 2001, it looked like the wait might finally be over. Once again, Apogee made a big splash at the convention and showed off a brand new trailer for the game with a lot of fanfare. As long as it came out soon, it would surely be well reviewed and sell like crazy. It didn't come out. Right around this time, the Apogee crew started thinking about that Prey game again. They clearly had their hands full with Duke Nukem, but they wanted another game in production. Over the years, they'd gotten to know a lot of other developers, and they were impressed by the guys at Human Head Studios. And so, Apogee offered Human Head the task of finishing Prey once and for all. As a bonus, they knew their old id buddies were about to finish up the Doom 3 tech and figured that they could use their old connections to get the engine before any other third party. In other words, Prey, a game originally meant to showcase Apogee's own engine, would now be using outside tech. Human Head agreed and waited for the Doom 3 engine to arrive, which took about a year longer than it was supposed to, making for yet another delay on yet another game. But at long last, Prey finally released onto store shelves in July 2006 for PC, alongside an Xbox 360 port developed by Venom Games. After all these years, the portal still made it into the finished game. However, they were not player-controlled, which meant that they were effectively just doors, although you could shoot yourself in the head with them. The game featured other, newer ways of messing with space as well, shifting gravity so that players could walk on walls and ceilings, and a spirit walk feature that let players get into blocked areas. It received good reviews, and by October of that year had sold 1 million copies. Not bad for a new IP. That being said, for a game that had been in development for 11 years, it certainly did not leave the impact on the gaming world that Apogee might have hoped. But at least, at last, it was done. though tellingly, to finish the game, they'd had to give it to somebody else. They refused to give Duke to anyone else, insisting that only the crew under George Broussard could possibly make a title good enough to be worthy of a, now aging, gaming icon. But age took its toll in unexpected ways. For one thing, Apogee paid their developers low salaries in exchange for a big share of the royalties. But no game meant no royalties, which meant that the staff had been underpaid for close to a decade now. Worse, since Apogee hadn't actually made a game since Shadow Warrior in 1997, it was hard to attract new talent, who now associated Apogee with endless delays. As if that wasn't enough, the game industry is a fast-changing one, and 10 years is a long time in that world. By 2006, Apogee had only spent about $7.5 million on Duke Nukem Forever, with a staff of about 36 people. But by the mid-2000s, a big game could cost well over $20 million to make, with a staff of 75 or more people. Apogee was still proceeding with the same production philosophy they had started with in 1997. If it wasn't enough back then, it was woefully inadequate now. As time went on, things only got more embarrassing for the studio. Technology evolved at a relentless pace. It would be nearly impossible for the little crew to create cutting-edge graphics. The game became the butt of endless jokes from both consumers and the press. The name didn't help anything. Not only was Forever right there in the title, but the initials were DNF, which racing fans know means did not finish. Famously, one fan actually started a website called the Duke Nukem Forever List, which listed all the things that had happened in the world since the start of DNF's production. Highlights include Google's entire existence, Britney Spears' entire career, and every single iProduct from Apple. For that matter, the list points out that the Beatles' entire career took less time than Duke Nukem Forever's production. And most astoundingly, from Kennedy's challenge to One Small Step, man landed on the moon in less time than it took George Broussard to make a game. By 2009, the jig was up. Despite re-releasing Duke Nukem 3D in 2008 for Xbox Live Arcade, Apogee was at last out of cash. After 12 entire years, Miller and Broussard were finally realizing that they had a problem. So they went to their publisher, Take-Two, and asked for $6 million to finally finish off the game. The publisher offered $2.5 million. For whatever reason, Apogee refused. After that, it was all over. On May 6, 2009, Apogee laid off its entire development team. For the first time in its existence, Apogee was not a developer, just a publisher with nothing to publish. As if enough bad news hadn't already beleaguered the guys, Take-Two sued them for never completing the promised Duke Nukem Forever. Apogee countersued Take-Two since the publisher had themselves never developed a different, contractually obligated Duke game, Duke Begins. The case was settled out of court and dropped in June 2010. After all this, Apogee still refuses to throw in the towel. In June 2010, they re-released another old Duke game, Duke Nukem Manhattan Project for the Xbox Live Arcade. And for that matter, 3D Realms still claims that they're working on Duke Nukem Forever, though what the nature of this work is, no one knows. For his part, Scott Miller started a new company in 2007, Radar Group, to develop new media franchises. Prey 2 is among the titles he's trying to get off the ground. However, to date, nothing but concept art has ever come out of Radar. Once upon a time, Scott Miller came up with a business model that was genuinely groundbreaking. And once upon a time, George Broussard made a game that was a smash hit. The problem was, after such huge early successes, they assumed that anything they touched would turn to gold. Taking the time to make sure your project is done right is an admirable thing, but only to a point. Nothing will ever be perfect. At some point, you have to finish what you've done and release it. Miller and Broussard could never get to that point, and now they've paid the price both in cash and reputation. For what it's worth, their story now stands as a warning to the rest of the gaming community. That delaying a game is not always for the best. That a great game is a focused vision and not a collection of disconnected ideas. and that even a company that has reached the highest apogee can still fall to its perigee.